when you open the door for somebody else.
Welcome into the Vaccine Conversation with Melissa and Dr. Bob. We are excited to be back with another super interesting and fun and exciting episode on aluminum. This is aluminum part 2, and
I think fun is a little bit of a stretch. Interesting, yes, for sure. But fun, I hope you guys aren't expecting fun. This is not really fun, but it's going to be interesting because we in season 2 are really trying to give you all the hard-hitting stuff as much as we can. Yeah. And that includes some really great interviews, but it also includes trying to tackle some of these topics you've been asking about for months, including aluminum. And, you know, I think part of the reason we didn't just jump right into it in season 1 is it's a huge topic.
Yeah.
And it requires a lot of research, and how do we take all that and summarize it and try to give the most important points, because it's hard to do that in just, you know, an hour and a half or 2 hours of time. So we sort of kind of left it and kept going for maybe the easier topics to get those off the list. But we can't delay this one anymore because we feel it's super important, and it's been important. But hopefully part 1, and this will be something you can send to people that are new to this issue, maybe don't understand the ingredients and components and don't understand why there are concerns. So we're hoping that we're going to give you some tools here to be able to pass along to your friends and family, and maybe for yourself to understand more about why aluminum is a problem. Why are we concerned about it? And how come what you keep hearing from your pediatrician or from the representatives at the CDC, what they say about how it's safe, how come that's not true, or where is that not true, and kind of deciphering between the information, because 2 totally different stories here about one thing being completely safe and lots of research and data to say it's not safe at all. So we are here with aluminum part 2.
Yes, and I want to maybe just remind everybody, we did create an aluminum video on immunityeducationgroup.org, our website. If you go there, you'll see somewhere on there it says, information or videos or something. We created 4 different videos, and one of them is on aluminum. And I think it's like a quick 3 to 4 minute summary of these 2 hours that you're getting in the podcast, all summarized in a quick 3 to 4 minutes visually, sort of like a cartoon video. And that would be a great tool to spread around and show your friends if they just want to get maybe the first, gosh, that kind of sounds interesting. Maybe I should research that more. That video could be the thing that prompts them to go down the rabbit hole.
And if you haven't gone to our website, which many of you might not have. You might just maybe follow me on Facebook, check Dr. Bob's Facebook page, and listen to the podcast and don't even know we have a website that we've had for 4 years now, a nonprofit immunity education group. So we have a Facebook page that we post every now and then. It's not super, super active, but we post every now and then. And we have some colleagues that post some interesting things in this this movement as well. But if you have not gone to immunityed.org, or immunityeducationgroup.org, go visit it, because we have a lot of articles, we have one-pagers, we have informational tools, we have some infographics, and we have some videos. This is kind of what we were doing for the first 2 to 3 years after 2015 when 277 passed in California, and that was kind of our first public education tool, was to get a website up. So we did that, and that's where we come from to do town halls and things like that. It's from Immunity Education Group. So if you haven't visited the website, please do, because there's a lot of information there. And you know what? We're going to continue updating it now. We have a little bit of a slightly new platform for the website. And
yeah, just went live. We just switched platforms, and
you
so
can't
it's
talk
a
when
whole
you're
new
chewing.
look. I'm not chewing. People can't tell.
By the way,
food in my mouth.
So I was listening to our last
Can
episode.
you guys tell I'm talking with food in my mouth?
I can totally tell when you were talking with
because you're
food.
looking at me. But
No. I listened the other day to our last the episode on exemptions. Yeah. As I'm listening, I'm like, oh my God, I can hear you chewing while you're trying to talk, which is so funny, because that's like manners 101, right? You're never supposed to talk with your mouth full.
You were supposed to keep talking longer before.
Then don't interject. You're like choosing to jump in right when your mouth's like full of chocolate.
I should have done the prolonged long.
Yeah. Just say a little more, Melissa, so I can swallow this mouthful of protein bar.
Okay, now
anyway,
I'm ready, I think.
I can still hear it,
Almost.
but keep going. Don't eat that last bite. Don't do it. Don't put it down.
Oh, wait, I'll save
it down.
I'll save it for your next
Monologue.
monologue.
But yes, visit the website. Lots of good information. That's about the most fun that you're going to have on this episode. That was it. That was the fun you were talking about.
Fun is over.
Now we're getting serious.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing that fascinates me probably the most in this aluminum issue is the idea of the aluminum we swallow and drink in our food. Ingested aluminum versus the aluminum you inject into your body. And it's very critical to know the difference and how the two different routes of administration work differently, because that's the whole crux of the safety issue. And one of the biggest arguments, again, that the pro-mandate crowd and the vaccine injury deniers will state is we eat and swallow so much aluminum every day, the tiny bit we inject adds almost nothing to that. Therefore, injected aluminum is safe. And if that was true, I would agree with them. They would be right. But it is so incredibly far from the truth. I mean, I think you're going to be shocked when I show you a few numbers. When you compare how much you swallow compared to how much you inject in vaccines, there is no comparison. They're not even in the same ballpark as a comparison. And I think you'll be hopefully very concerned about the amount that you are injecting into yourself or your children if you vaccinate, and how you will hopefully talk to others about this issue.
So if you go to CDCgov and you type in adjuvants or vaccine safety or aluminum safety, this is what comes up. An article says, what is an adjuvant and why is it added to a vaccine? And it says right at the beginning, an adjuvant is an ingredient used in some vaccines that helps create a stronger immune response. I mean, that sounds very positive, right? It says, in other words, adjuvants help vaccines work better. How simple can you get? They make it work better. Like, don't ask too many questions. And then it says adjuvants help the body produce an immune response that's strong enough to protect the person from the disease. Again, let's come back to what the fear is. The fear is you getting that disease. It does say adjuvanted vaccines can cause more local reactions like redness and swelling at the injection site, or potentially fever or chills.
Can I guess, which is proof that it's working?
Proof that it's working.
Is that what they say? Or
it doesn't say, but they already know you know by now.
Okay.
So then the next topic on this says adjuvants have been used safely in vaccines for decades. Just like you're saying, that's the next thing. Aluminum salts have been used safely in vaccines for more than 70 years, just like you're saying. In all cases, they're tested for safety and effectiveness in clinical trials before they're licensed. They're continuously monitored by the CDC and the FDA. So anyway, so if you are looking at information on aluminum safety and you go to the CDC.gov website, they're literally going to tell you what I just told you. They've been monitored for decades. They are safe. They make it work better. And then you might have a localized reaction, but nothing too big. And the CDC and the FDA are closely monitoring the safety of all vaccines. But I want to, in part one, we talked briefly about this symposium, this conference in 2000.
Well, can I interject? Did they actually say anywhere there that we have scientifically proven it is safe? Or did they just say, don't worry, we are monitoring it? Because I almost didn't even hear you say, don't worry, public, the FDA and the CDC are sure that it's safe.
It doesn't say that, but it says adjuvants have been used safely in vaccines for decades. They've been used safely.
Okay.
It doesn't.
That's kind of a very generic statement.
Right.
See, they're not standing up and saying, don't worry, public, we know it's safe.
And they're not necessarily
safe
for those who receive it. That was not what the message was. They've been used safely for decades really doesn't mean that right now the amount that you're given is totally safe.
Exactly.
They don't say that. But
but the reason I point that out is you'll see the CDC statements are often that way when it's something controversial. They'll like print things that kind of sound good and sound like everything's okay, but if you actually read between the lines or read what's missing, what they're not saying.
Because it's semantics. They come down to how to say it in a way that makes it so they're not lying.
Exactly.
This is all completely by design.
Yeah, like when you look at their whooping cough vaccine information, even though they know the whooping cough vaccine doesn't stop you from catching whooping cough and doesn't stop you from spreading it around to others, it doesn't stop you from catching the germ, so you'll still be contagious and it's not a public health benefit. They do every possible thing they can to avoid saying that on their website. and they'll say everything else great about the vaccine and how it'll help you from feeling sick, and it might prevent you from feeling like you have the infection. And it reduces the rates of, symptomatic whooping cough in people. They'll say it every way so that the public doesn't realize there's no public health benefit. That's just another example if you really read what they say. So anyone who really likes to look at CDC information as a source, you really have to read it with a lot of scrutiny. And because you'll see there's a lot of things they're actually not saying in what they write.
So in that symposium, they basically called together all these people that are experts, immunologists, doctors, different researchers and things to talk about aluminum. And this is in the year 2000. This is May 2000. So what was interesting is after that time, so everybody's presenting concerns, right? It's not until 2 years later that they actually publish what are kind of the results of that meeting.
Oh, okay.
And what they published in the results were, quote, the message from this conference for the global public should stress the safety of adjuvants and the vaccines. So after literally listening to a bunch of people talk about concerns they had, scientists that are bringing their data, that are talking about guaranteed issues with aluminum, the takeaway from that 2 years later that they decided to publish was vaccines are safe and aluminum is safe and the vaccines are safe and so is the aluminum in vaccines. And so that was the message we as a public got. And they're telling you this is what they should stress for the global public. This is the message for the public that needs to be stressed. They're telling people what needs to be told. They're not saying the results of what that conference said. They're not summarizing the concerns and talking about that. They literally wiped all that clean and came out with a 2-sentence summary basically of saying it was all good, everything works, everything's fine. And it wasn't even published until 2 years later.
Well, do you want to jump into, you had a kind of a summary of ingested versus injected?
Well, so like we mentioned on part one of the big arguments that you'll hear from the CDC, from your doctor, from Paul Offit, all these people that talk about aluminum, the same kind of thing they do with, formaldehyde. And it's like, oh, you'll get more of that in a pear than, they have a lot of these arguments to sort of minimize the concern and the risk. And so the big argument here is that I've found is they talk about it's totally safe to have X number. You're getting more in formula, you're getting more, and you'll go in to talk about that. But what they're not talking to people about is that there are 2 different methods of aluminum getting to your body. And this totally goes back to our interview we had with Dr. Thomas Cowan, talking about the 2 parts of the immune system and how you have the cell-mediated response and the humoral response. And what vaccines do is they bypass the first response. That first response is when a virus or a bacteria goes in your nose or your mouth. It goes through the body and through the protective gastrointestinal tract, which is your body's first line of defense. So typically, if a virus or bacteria goes in that way, your body can handle it differently, handle it better, and it can move towards excreting things that are toxic or risky to your body. But when that's being bypassed, so your body is now getting a product like aluminum that is not bioavailable to them. It's not creating biochemical reactions that are natural. And it's getting it in a method that it is not used to also. And so we've got this difference between ingested aluminum and injected aluminum. So when you ingest aluminum, it is excreted through the kidneys. Okay, and so what researchers have said was that's good for people with healthy kidneys, except at 2 ends of the age spectrum. Very young, where the kidneys are still developing, this is what he says, and the older people, where the kidneys are no longer working.
Yeah.
Now, granted, there'll be the other people who maybe have kidney problems, and that's a third category there. So you can... when your body's able to excrete it, you can obviously maybe handle a little bit more. And that's what the medical establishment is using as their reference point for aluminum. Now, injecting aluminum, and this is kind of the big thing, the big takeaway. If you take away nothing else from what Dr. Bob says the rest of this episode, no, I'm just kidding. If you take away nothing else, remember this. Injecting aluminum, okay, it's a different method of excretion by design. So an adjuvant is there. It's meant to stay there. It is meant to stay in the body. It is not meant to be excreted because it is needed to keep the antigen, be attached to the antigen so it will work if you are presented with that particular virus or bacteria for many years in your life. The idea is if it were to be excreted a day after you got the vaccine, it wouldn't work and it would be pointless. So by design, aluminum is not something that is supposed to be out of your body. And the problem is if it stays in your body, and we'll talk about this later, where does it go? So again, ingested aluminum that we take in through the body has a way to be excreted. It's going through the gastrointestinal tract, and our kidneys are able to release the toxic portions of it. When it is injected, it doesn't go through that means in the body. And so as a result, the adjuvant that is meant to stick around is going to find another place to deposit in the body. And what they found is that the deposits in places in the body like the bones and the brain. And so this is why it's a concern, is it does not get out of the body. It's not supposed to. So if you hear the argument, well, we take in more aluminum in our food or in our water, it's like that is completely unrelated to what we're talking about, because vaccines that contain aluminum adjuvants are not going through the mouth. They are going through the body in an injected form. So that's my general overview of ingested versus injected.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And when you told me that maybe a week ago, I never even thought of that way before. And it's actually very fascinating. Yeah, the fact that a vaccine injected into the muscle is designed to stay there. And the adjuvant is designed to stay there around so the immune system can keep reacting to it and keep responding and creating an ongoing immune response.
Otherwise, what's the point of it?
Right, exactly. So my perspective on ingested aluminum takes a little bit further than what you were just explaining. Is basically, when we swallow aluminum in food or water, 99.7% of it leaves our body through the GI tract in our stools. 99.7% of it doesn't even actually get absorbed into our bloodstream. We just pass it right out. So it's as if you never even ate that much. It's as if you didn't even eat a whole bunch of aluminum, because almost all of it's just going to immediately leave through the GI tract right away, as long as you have a healthy GI tract, right? 0.3% of what you eat does get absorbed through a healthy GI tract into the bloodstream. And then, as you were saying, then it gets excreted by the kidneys. Our body's designed to handle it that way. So that's what we do with ingested aluminum. And then, of course, when you inject aluminum, 100% of it goes into your body because you're injecting it all, right? So the reason why this matters is you will hear people who talk about the safety of aluminum. They'll state the fact that every baby in the first 6 months of life swallows about 7,000 micrograms of aluminum in their breast milk, right? Because moms, there's aluminum in your breast milk because it's in there from what you eat and what's in your body, and a little bit gets in the breast milk.
And people forget you have canned foods. These are lined with aluminum canned foods. Yeah. People use aluminum foil in cooking. There are a lot of things that
aluminum antiperspirants.
Right. There are a lot of things we have just in our regular homes, day-to-day use, that we don't realize that are in contact with our food that would get that into the mother, that would pass that through the breast milk. Right. It's not that it was just in her body on its own because that's how humans are designed. It's because we're now exposed to that. So 500 years ago, there would have been zero in breast milk because there was none in the environment. But now, like we said, post-industrial revolution, now it's in the mothers and therefore going to the babies.
Yeah, thank you. So again, a breastfed baby in the first 6 months is going to get about 7,000 micrograms. Now, a formula-fed baby is going to get about 38,000 micrograms.
That's almost aluminum. 6 times higher, almost.
Right. Yeah. So babies do eat a lot, and so that's probably the one thing I'll agree with doctors who talk about how safe aluminum is I will agree that you sure do eat a lot and drink a lot as a baby. Okay, now when you're getting vaccines in the first 6 months, you will get about a total of 4,000 micrograms in all the vaccines. So 7,000 that you swallow if you're breastfed, 38,000 if you're formula fed, and about 4,000 in the vaccines. Well, here's kind of the kicker and why this matters. So again, like someone who promotes, aluminum for vaccines will say, well, you're getting injected with way less. And we're getting so much anyway. So who cares about getting a little bit more if you're injected? Well, if you think about it, if you're a baby and you swallow 7,000 micrograms in your breast milk in 6 months, but only 0.3% of that is actually absorbing into your bloodstream, because again, you're pooping out 99.7% of it, that 7,000 micrograms you eat really is only about 20 micrograms that gets into your bloodstream. It's only 20. And if you're getting 38,000 in formula, you're only absorbing about 115 micrograms in your diet over 6 months. So now the true comparison of the ingested aluminum in formula or breast milk compared to the injected aluminum in vaccines that actually physically goes inside your body, the comparison is really 4,000 injected and only 20 or 115 micrograms ingested in breast milk or formula. There's no safety comparison whatsoever. You can't say 4,000 injected is safe because the 20 or the 115 that you ate is safe. I mean, you guys, hopefully you're understanding what I'm saying here. I mean, it's like, and that's what you'll hear the doctors say. They'll say it's all safe because it's all kind of equal amounts. No, it's not.
Well, it's 200 times.
Is that the math? 200
times. If you're a breastfed baby, you're getting 200 times more aluminum into the body. If you, through your vaccines in those first 6 months, than you would get from breast milk
Than
for
what
6
you
months.
swallowed.
That's 200 times.
Yeah, that's amazing.
From what's actually getting absorbed into the bloodstream, which that is very statistically significant. That is a huge, so essentially what you're saying is they're trying to say ingested aluminum is safe, but that's because only about 20 micrograms for a breastfed baby is getting absorbed into the bloodstream. So 20 micrograms over 6 months is pretty
Probably
safe.
is safe,
The problem is that's not what's happening with babies on the CDC schedule. They're getting 4,000 micrograms injected into the bloodstream over that same time.
Right. And then people will say, well, if you just look at 1 day at a time, if you're a breastfed baby or a formula, in any 1 day, you're getting like 1 microgram. You're getting very little in 1 day from your diet. But if you get all the shots on schedule, you're getting 1,225 micrograms in just 1 day injected into you. And I can do that math. That's 1,225 times the amount you're getting injected in 1 day versus what your baby ate that day. So there is completely scientifically invalid and erroneous and in fact just completely false to say that injected vaccine aluminum is safe because we eat more. Because technically we're eating way less than what's injected into us as far as when you look at what really goes into us. So I think that's a very critical factor because honestly, that's probably the main argument that those who support aluminum will make is how we think it's safe. And that argument is completely bogus.
Well, kind of leading in, and you're going to talk about, you said some animal studies later, but what's interesting is the minimal risk level, which is the MRL that they have decided for humans, was basically derived from aluminum that they fed to mice. So there was only one study that they used based on mice, right? And a single animal study, and this is the minimal risk level. And they did the minimal risk based on what was fed to them, not even injected into the mice. So it was what was fed to mice. That's a big difference. It says, but infants are injected with aluminum. So injected aluminum bypasses the gastrointestinal tract, as we said, and has unique toxic properties compared to aluminum that is ingested. Okay, so obviously, if you want to really look at aluminum safety, they should be safety testing injected aluminum only.
Yes, yeah.
Unfortunately, what they're using as the number of safety, where up to this point there's not going to be any, we didn't see any adverse risks associated. They're using ingested aluminum in an animal model. And only one study has ever shown that. And so this entire crux of the vaccine program being safe and all these doses of all these aluminum-containing vaccines being safe is completely based on ingested aluminum in one animal study, which does not relate at all to, again, what's actually happening.
I like to talk about what studies we do have where they actually have injected people with aluminum and monitored what happens to the aluminum. And these studies actually go way back. And hopefully you'll be shocked by this. I could only find 2 studies that ever studied what happens in humans when you inject aluminum IV. Only two human studies and then 1 infant study with injecting it into the muscle. So I want to just go over those really quick because the shocking thing is we are giving vaccines to 4 million babies in America every year, and how many millions worldwide every year with aluminum in them. based on the fact that we have only studied the safety in about 22 humans. We've only done live injected studies in only 22 humans in the history of medicine that I can find. And that's what we're basing this, worldwide, aluminum vaccine injection policy. And to me, that just is extremely concerning. How can we justify injecting so much? And we've only studied it in 22 humans total. So where those studies come from, the main place is Priest is the researcher. He published in 2004 in the Journal of Environmental Monitoring. He published a study, a review of 2 old studies. These studies go way, way, way back. He just kind of did an updated publication that explains the studies. In one study, one scientist gave himself an IV injection of aluminum, and after 100 days, 90% of it had come out of his body. So he had filtered out probably his kidneys, filtered out 90% of what he injected IV. And then the other study was done in 1993, and it was 6 adults were given intravenous aluminum. And after 24 hours, 60% of it came out of the body, and a little bit more came out within a week later, but they never found out what happened to the remaining 30%. They didn't study them more than a week. So they don't know if it eventually all came out. That's all they've ever studied in live human subjects when it comes to injecting aluminum IV. Is one man volunteered himself, and then 6 more adults volunteered many years ago. And they never even proved that it all came out. Some of it, they never saw it all came out. Some of it remained in there during the length of the study. So then I think the medical community kind of realized recently, oh my gosh, we only have 2 actual live human studies. We should do another study. So in JAMA Pediatrics in 2013, some researchers studied 15 preterm babies. They gave these 15 preterm babies in a neonatal intensive care unit. They gave these babies their 2-month shots because they were all at the right age. They gave them their recommended scheduled shots. They measured their blood and their urine levels of aluminum right before the shots, and then they measured the blood and the urine aluminum levels 24 hours after the shots. Yeah, so they compared the pre-vaccine aluminum levels in their bloodstream and what they were peeing out in the urine, compared it to what was in the blood and in the urine 24 hours after the shots. And they basically found the levels did not change much. The levels did not increase. So kind of what they concluded was we gave all these, shots into the muscles of these newborn babies, and the aluminum did not come out of the muscles into the bloodstream. It didn't raise the bloodstream levels, and it did not start excreting within 24 hours in the urine. And that's all they studied, and that's all they published. They didn't, study for weeks where the aluminum went. I think they were just trying to answer one question was, does giving a vaccine aluminum, does it raise your blood levels instantly and immediately? And the answer was no. And so what I think people will do is they'll look at that study and they'll say, well, look, we've proven aluminum is safe. We just gave, shots to 15 newborns and they were all, fine, and their aluminum levels didn't change. And so therefore the aluminum must therefore magically be safe. Well, that is the only recent live injected aluminum study that I can find anywhere. And in fact, it's the only human injected vaccine aluminum study that I can even find where they studied levels anywhere. And that should concern everybody. There's been a complete lack or complete absence of any sort of human research on what happens to this aluminum. And again, that's extremely concerning to me. So should we as a society be making a policy that says aluminum is perfectly safe for everybody based on the fact that we studied it in 7 adults many years ago given IV and 15 babies, given recent shots? Does that constitute adequate safety research? I'd say completely no, it definitely doesn't. To me, where I think we've kind of gotten into trouble is our vaccine industry started using aluminum, many, many decades ago in all those original vaccines, hoping it was safe, even though way back then some doctors knew it wasn't, as Melissa pointed out. Then they started making more vaccines with aluminum. And then suddenly, in the early 2000s or the late 90s, everyone suddenly realized, oh no, aluminum really is toxic. But now the industry is stuck with it. The vaccine industry depends on aluminum, and half of our vaccines wouldn't exist without aluminum. And so what is an industry to do when they realize like their whole healthcare system relies on this part of the industry? Now there's a potential toxicity, a potential danger to everybody. Can an industry just come to a stop? Can they, suddenly stop giving something? No, they can't. They can't just, they just can't look at it that way. They have to figure out a way to make it palatable, make it seem safe to everybody so they can keep using it while they find new, safer methods. So I'm convinced that they know.
If they're finding new, safer methods.
Right.
I mean, like actually trying to find methods that they're going to utilize and start formulating things.
I gotta believe they are, but you're right.
We're talking about what we said in part one. In 1927, there were concerns about aluminum.
Right.
So they went ahead with that in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, and now we're almost in the 2020s. They've known that there are risks. They've had plenty of time to reformulate things. We know they've reformulated things with thimerosal in the past. We know it can be done, and it was done pretty quickly, I think, once they figured out how damaging it was. I think it's going to be costly, and it's going to be time consuming, and it's going to be a humongous pain that, again, they have not seen the public up in arms about this enough yet to warrant that, but they know it needs to happen. They just, it's such a huge project to do it. They're waiting until they're going to be pushed against a wall to do it.
Yeah. And so their only thing that they can do is just to reassure everyone it's safe and come up with like pseudoscience to demonstrate that it's safe.
But meanwhile, they continue to add more doses of more vaccines, and that's compounding the problem. So, like researchers have said, if you would have had one or two of these aluminum-containing vaccines, you might be okay, 1 or 2 doses of these things.
Yeah.
But because that's not what kids are getting, it's causing problems in the body, and it's combining with other things that are causing problems in the body. And the more doses, the more components, the more chances, the odds increase for having some unnatural responses in the body that we're not going to understand for 40 or 50 years from now, because we'll be able to look back and kind of have more data to kind of see what went wrong. But parents, meanwhile, are the ones screaming out saying something's going wrong, and everybody else is trying just to, to basically hush them and say you're crazy because science says otherwise. But truthfully, science does say what we're saying. It's just they're not doing the studies in enough detail to really highlight exactly each of these individual cases because there are so many. It manifests so differently for every child. Yeah. I mean, we're looking at this neurodegenerative disorders. There are so many things. It's not only one thing. And because it's not only one thing, that's spreading out the injuries into casting a much wider net. And it's harder to research a much wider net like that because it's not one component, one disease. We're talking about something that's very widespread, and it totally shows up in different ways, and it shows up months later or years later. So this is a really hard thing to get a grasp on, to really say, see, pinpoint, here's the problem. But even without knowing exactly those details, we still know aluminum in itself is a problem. And knowing it's a problem, bar none, period, end of story, they should get it out of all vaccines. It's just that simple.
Yeah, and it's curious. I mean, if you look at our history, anytime we've figured out something was toxic, our industry eventually gets rid of it, does away with it. And we talked about like lead,
But why though?
Yeah, you're right. Because the public had an outcry.
It takes years and decades for this to happen.
Right. And so we went with unleaded gas. We now use lead-free paint. Using lead as an example. But to me, it kind of speaks to the power of the pharmaceutical industry that they've known aluminum is dangerous for what, almost a century now. And they are still moving forward with more and more aluminum-containing vaccines. They actually doubled the amount of aluminum in the Gardasil vaccine. The original Gardasil had 225, now it has 500. And this is an industry that should know there's risks, yet they actually doubled it in their new product. Maybe they needed to double it in order to produce an immune response. But it speaks to the hold that the pharmaceuticals as a unique industry has over our government and policy. Because, if, say, we find some chemical is dangerous, like we found certain plastics are dangerous. Well, they took those out, pretty quickly.
Yeah, like BPAs.
And because of public outcry. But the media and the pharmaceutical companies are working so hard to prevent the public outcry on aluminum. If they can keep the public quiet, then there's no market drive to get the government to do anything and to get pharma to do anything. And that should really, really concern everybody. And hopefully it does. And I just wanted to maybe circle back to where the research industry is going with this, because I think the research industry is starting to cry out more and more about aluminum. And, again, our Cochrane database of systematic diseases that I alluded to in episode 1, they're the ones that published that infamous 2004 study claiming aluminum is so safe in vaccines that no one needs to research it again. Well, in 2017, issue 9 of their Cochrane database of systematic reviews, they conclude that they consider it important to re-look at aluminum in vaccines for several reasons. First of all, they admit that their 2004 study, quotes, was based on poor quality evidence, end quotes. They actually say that there are several new aluminum adjuvants that have come to market since their 2004 review, because back then there was only one aluminum adjuvant. Now there are several, including the one that's in Gardasil. It's a brand new, very complicated aluminum adjuvant. And because there are all these new adjuvants, that's one reason we need to study it. They actually the Cochrane group found 6 studies that found that the HPV vaccine might be highly reactive and causing a lot of side effects because of its aluminum and its type of adjuvant. And they actually quote one mouse study done by INBAR that showed behavioral abnormalities in aluminum injections versus placebo. And there are actually dozens of such animal studies, but they just point to one. So even the Cochrane group is now calling for a need to relook at aluminum in vaccines. And when a group like the Cochrane Group asks for that, the scientific community usually takes that seriously, because that group is been well respected for many years. And now there's been a recent shakeup in the Cochrane Group, and did you know this? They actually the board fired the chair of the Cochrane research group, because he claims he was being too objective, and some of the pharmaceutically influenced members of the Cochrane Group supposedly kicked him out, and now the Cochrane Group might have more pharmaceutical influence according to the claims, according to these people's opinions. I don't know for sure, but the Cochrane Group has always been kind of the leaders of systematic objective research. And so just 2 years ago, guys, they cried foul and said, we need to relook at this. There's a potential problem, and here's all the reasons. And so I hope the scientific community will take that seriously.
Yeah, and when I was looking into discussing aluminum, obviously there are literally hundreds of research articles that talk about this in different ways that I have yet to go through, but have them all listed. So again, one of these studies that I came across was actually in toxicology. This is the Journal of Trace Elements in Medicine and Biology. And this is 2018, so this is new. And it says this is a reconsideration of the immunotherapeutic pediatric safe dose levels of aluminum.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is Lyonsweiler and Ricketson who have written this. So this is looking at the levels of what's considered safe for infants with injected aluminum, in this case, because they're looking specifically at vaccines, and reconsidering what's safe. Now, some of the highlights of this article say that aluminum levels in vaccines are based on immune efficacy, and they ignore the body weight for safety. So I alluded to this in our part 1. Completely ignoring body weight, which, in the Bill Maher interview with Dr. Jay Gordon, he talked about in a hepatitis B vaccine, as a 180-pound man, you will get the same dose that you'll give to a 12-pound baby. And that should be something that's concerning, because there is absolutely no way the body can handle the ingredients the same way based on that type of size and the size of the organs that are responsible for helping your body eliminate some of this stuff. So that's something everybody should kind of be concerned with. I mean, this goes for all vaccines, that they are not really dose dependent. We used to have the flu shot that was half the dose, right? That they now have essentially switched out with a full dose, knowing that a 6-month-old will get the same size dose that a full adult male will receive for the flu shot. And that could also contain thimerosal or mercury, which is extremely dangerous. So another highlight here, the safety inferences of vaccine doses of aluminum have relied solely on dietary exposure studies of adult mice and rats. So they're using, for adult mice and rats that are ingesting aluminum, that has been what they've used to create the safe levels for infant humans who are being injected with aluminum.
That's amazing. And I never even thought of that. Not only have they barely even studied injected ones, it didn't even occur to me that the safety levels they came up with are based on ingested, again, and not adjuvants, just regular aluminum. So that even speaks even more to the fact that we really have almost zero safety knowledge whatsoever on aluminum adjuvants and vaccines.
And they should be using newborn and infant mice.
Yeah.
So Dr. Shaw says that newborn mice are even more developed than newborn babies. They're more mature. Their bodies are even more mature. So even if they studied newborn mice, it still wouldn't be the equivalent of what, newborn infants are, human infants. But instead of even studying newborn mice or infant mice, they're studying adult mice, which is totally different again than what we're doing. And so the big takeaway here was on day 1 of life, infants receive 17 times more injected aluminum than would be allowed if the doses were adjusted by body weight.
Right.
So this is just based on one vaccine.
Yeah, the hepatitis B.
17 times more aluminum than would be allowed. So again, the name of this study is called Reconsideration of the Immunotherapeutic Pediatric Safe Dose Levels of Aluminum. And it goes into all sorts of really interesting details. Again, it's reminding you that aluminum is used as an adjuvant because it enhances the immune response of the vaccine. This is why they use it. And so what they've done was the FDA has set an amount of what they consider aluminum per vaccine that was derived from data, which is 850 micrograms. This is what they say per vaccine is their quote unquote, level amount. It doesn't really say safety amount, but it's basically, enhances the effectiveness of the vaccine, but does not include safety considerations. There's nothing super off the charts at that point that they noticed, again, with one particular vaccine. But they remind you that current amounts of aluminum are not adjusted to body weight. So one thing I found really interesting was because we're getting aluminum in lots of different sources, they have levels that they've established what's considered safe for aluminum from all different sources. And they create this minimal risk level, or MMRL, to really look at the adverse effects that could come after that certain point. So the committees on this is back in 1989, created that number for adults to be 7,000 micrograms per kilogram per week. Okay, this was the amount that was considered from all sources. This is the most amount of aluminum you should ever get. This is 1989. What I think is so crazy is that level stayed into effect until 2011 when they revised it. And guess what number that went down to? All the way down to 2,000. So they were almost 4 times too high. So between 1989 and 2011, they realized this is way higher than what we should be getting. And what's interesting is what happened between 2000 and 2011 is we had a lot more vaccines that had aluminum added to the schedule. The number was really increasing at that point. And so in 1989, they thought, oh, sure, 7,000 micrograms per kilo is going to be fine per week for any adult. All of a sudden, they realized that number's way too high, not just a little bit too high. Yeah. They didn't just go down a little bit.
Times,
I mean, that's a big change. And that makes you wonder, oh my God, for the last, 20 years, essentially, you've been allowing people to be taking in, not to be concerned about their numbers, and they've been taking in a lot more. This is probably right about the point when they started taking away some of the canning linings of aluminum and changing the process, because they realized things like tomatoes and the acidity of certain foods that were canned was actually combining chemically with this aluminum that was stored in, and it was going into the body, and it wasn't safe. Even in an ingested form, it wasn't safe back then. So it's kind of interesting, I thought, that they reduced that level so greatly because that makes me a little nervous that they allowed it to be so high for so long. But what the FDA says, and they said the regulations require that proteins in vaccines are tested for safety. So they only require proteins in vaccines to be tested for safety. It says aluminum is a known neurotoxin, and it is unfortunate that additives in vaccines are not required to be subjected to animal safety studies before they use them on human subjects.
Oh,
so they're saying they're only required by the FDA to test proteins in vaccines, aka the antigens. They are not required to actually, on animal safety studies, they are not required to test the additives or, these are components. And in this case, it would be an aluminum adjuvant is an additive.
Yeah.
And so that is not required by the FDA, you guys, to have animal safety studies before they test it on human subjects. And then I just read you from the CDC. It says, don't worry, we're constantly monitoring. The FDA and the CDC are constantly monitoring.
They sure are.
Aluminum, yeah, but just not in a way that affects us because you don't even have to be monitored according to this. So essentially what they did a whole bunch of mathematical models in this study. And basically what they came down to is that a child should never receive more than 44 micrograms per kilo. This is a child who has, middle of the line body weight, because they do it again by weight, should never receive more than 44 micrograms per kilo. And what that comes down to when we talk about actual pounds.
Which includes ingested, like all sources.
This
right?
is injected. No, they're just talking about injected
Okay.
specifically, I believe, just for aluminum exposure. And they looked at like just the DTaP, for example. And a baby who's 4.5 pounds, that might be preemie, that's given 2-month vaccines adjusted because they were born premature, them getting a DTaP, just a DTaP dose, is getting 28 times the amount of aluminum based on body weight than they should be getting. And if you are a full-term baby, you're, say, 11 pounds, so even bigger than a full-term baby, and that's about the weight you are when you get your first 2-month vaccines, assuming you only get DTaP.
Right.
You're still getting 17 times the safe levels of aluminum based on what's injected, based on body weight with the FDA's own information.
Yeah.
And then if you are a 22-pound baby, so now you're further along, you're still getting 5 times the amount you should be getting just in one vaccine. And that's not including all the other vaccines that you would be getting.
Right.
So the entire purpose of this study, they go through and they talk about this dosing that the FDA has decided that's considered safe and this limit of risk and what they've included. But what they're saying is, if you adjust this based on body weight, which is what should happen, you are overdosing these children with aluminum, which we already know based on numbers. But looking at the combined doses at 2 months, 4 months, and 6 months of the 1225, 975, and 1225 respectively, they are way, way, way over what is considered safe. And they're saying based on the FDA's own numbers, this needs to be completely reconsidered. Even a 2-year-old should be getting a lot less than what they're getting. I think at a 2-year-old it should be about 58 micrograms per kilo, which is still a really, really small amount. And so anyway, the results of this study, basically they say they predict an increase risk of neurotoxicity from birth to 36 months. Particularly when the body burden is taken into consideration at every scheduled vaccine interval. So they are saying in today's current CDC schedule, their results are predicting an increased risk of neurotoxicity from birth all the way to 3 years old, particularly when you are following the CDC schedule. And it says this is because there will be a retained body burden. And this is another thing that people aren't talking about. There will be a retained body burden fraction of aluminum resulting from previous dosing intervals. So you've already gotten your vaccines at 2 months. It's not leaving the body. So it is still there and you are now adding to it. So that body burden is getting heavier and heavier with every single appointment. And they're saying this needs to be considered because of potential toxicities. And what was interesting in the conflicts of interest that they list here, one of the authors had to list in a conflict of interest. It's a potential conflict of interest because he consulted on 2 vaccine injury cases on behalf of a complainant.
Oh, wow.
Considering that somebody is going to federal vaccine court because of an injury that had to do with aluminum. And he, as a scientist or researcher, was testifying on behalf of that person, actually had to put that as a conflict of interest, which is all he was doing was giving research, right? And you've got all of these pharma-funded studies that are giving you outputs that, and they're not even really talking about how funded they are from X, Y, and Z, and nobody pays attention to that fine print. I thought that was really interesting when I read that. I'm like, how is that a conflict of interest? The guy's just doing his job and giving information, and somehow he has to disclose that in his study. Because why? Because this study does not say stuff that they want people to say, which is the numbers are too high, the dosing is too high.
Right. Well, and that's not the only recent study to actually
definitely
talk about the worries. I mean, I found this very interesting study, and this is from the University of Ottawa in Canada, and it was in Critical Reviews in Toxicology just in 2014, so 5 years ago. It's the systematic review of potential health risks posed by pharmaceutical, occupational, and consumer exposures to aluminum oxides, aluminum hydroxides, and soluble salts. Sorry, that's very long, but we'll give you the link to it. But basically, this very mainstream group of 10 researchers from a university in Canada, they looked at all aluminum exposures, like every source, food, water, products, IV solutions, and vaccines, which is great that a mainstream group would include vaccines in that list of exposures, because very few people will, right? And they basically looked at all available research over the preceding 7 years, every study that came out. They concluded that adverse effects to vaccines with aluminum adjuvants have occurred. The scientific literature on the adverse health effects of aluminum is extensive, and we need better justification for routine addition of aluminum to vaccines. They also concluded that the research shows a link between Alzheimer's and aluminum and getting in the brain, and that patients have way more aluminum when you finally are able to do autopsies on them. Patients have way more aluminum accumulation in their brain than we'd expect only from diet and from using deodorants. They concluded there must be a third source of aluminum somewhere that's creating these very high levels. And the only source they can think of is vaccines. Again, this is just like the Cochrane group in 2017 said, we need to keep researching this. This University of Ottawa group says there are problems, we need to keep researching it. More and more researchers are starting to talk about this, and that's very encouraging from a research perspective, but it hasn't reached the policymakers and those who, mandate, vaccines, and those who are pushing for mandates and people who are continuing to deny vaccine injuries. None of this is reaching them yet, and it might take a lot longer for us to get there. But I'm very encouraged to see how many more mainstream groups are finding potential problems and publishing it successfully.
Well, and this idea of body weight is just a no-brainer. And one of the things in the end of the article that I read is they talk about that they need to look at vaccination practices in the NICU, and they need to revisit this. And I had a friend with a micro-preemie who was constantly being asked about being vaccinated when her baby was born at 25 weeks, and they were willing to give the full 2-month thing before she was even reaching what her due date would have been. I mean, we're talking about looking at it based on body weight. It needs to be revisited completely and discussed. They say these should be calculated per child given their body weight prior to vaccination, and daily limits placed on total aluminum injected considering all doses and all sources need to be there. And that just seems like a pretty logical thing. Something funny I came across when I was looking through some things was this, it was like a science article talking about research that's going to be done. This is 2017 in Science Nordic. We do see a lot of research coming out of the Norwegian areas, in Denmark and in Norway, and which they have a vaccine schedule that is about half of what we have here, coincidentally. But anyway, in this article, so the article is called New Research Project to Investigate Aluminum in Vaccines. Okay, but what's so funny is the subline right underneath that says, previous research does not indicate any problems caused by aluminum. So the title's like, New Research Project to Investigate Aluminum. Well, you don't investigate something unless there's a problem. And then right underneath that, it goes, previous research does not indicate any problems caused by aluminum. Like,
yeah, they're like, hold on, we're
Yeah.
not saying it's dangerous.
Totally.
We're not saying there's a problem. We just want to study it. 'Cause
right.
we're
And so what the
scientists.
doctors say is they go, our idea is not driven by suspicion. It's driven by the fact, listen to this, it's driven by the fact that this has not been properly studied.
Yeah. Well, that's a very wise statement. I mean, I love how they put it that way.
But the funny thing is, that is a suspicion. I'm suspicious of the fact that you've not properly studied
Yeah,
these things.
yeah.
So it says our idea is not driven by a suspicion. It's driven by the fact that this has not been properly studied. He says it like a fact. End of story.
Right.
This is just a couple years ago. This has not been studied. He's talking about aluminum in vaccines. He said the observation so far is that there isn't enough evidence to determine whether aluminum is problematic or not.
All right.
So, right, they can't really say it's safe. They're not saying it's not safe. What they're saying is there's not enough data to say if it's problematic.
Right.
And that in itself is problematic. That's the whole point.
Yeah, especially
It's
when you're injecting the entire world with
all
this
the time,
substance.
multiple times.
Right.
And so they say that no link has ever been shown between aluminum and vaccines and any substantial side effects in register or epidemiological studies. But then they say, but a register study might not show any side effects of aluminum, according to Dr. Jacobson. So he said, we don't see any links that are showing these. But then again, these studies are actually designed not to show side effects of aluminum. He said, in order to
yes.
assess the effects of aluminum with any certainty, you'd have to follow two groups of comparable patients and only give one of the groups aluminum. Can you believe he has to say this?
Wait, these Norwegians are crazy.
I know.
When it comes to research.
He says, so it is important to conduct randomized clinical trials with a control group, and results of register studies are always uncertain. So what he's saying, all the data that they have are based on register studies and epidemiological studies that do not show side effects, but they're not designed to show side effects.
Right.
So that's why title, new research needs to investigate these aluminum in vaccines. But oh, by the way, it's not like we have any problems. We're just going to, I mean, come on, you guys, when we know that studies cost, could be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Nobody's doing a study just to see for fun. There's something that is guiding them here. There's some data that they do have that is giving them a hypothesis that is plausible enough to warrant getting grants, getting funding, getting a research team, putting the several months it might take together. Nobody does this stuff just for fun. They're doing it because there's something leading them there. And they can't say that yet, because obviously that's not favorable and they haven't done it yet. But there's a reason they're investigating aluminum. Investigating is a very strong word to use in a title. That means something might be suspicious or a problem, but then they have to go back to clarify that, just because you're not allowed to say these things, even though you should be. So I thought this was kind of interesting. Curious to see the research that they have come across from that point. I'll have to look up and follow up and see if that study has been was completed and what they came across. But he still is saying the proper research hasn't been done. So how is it that we're this many years into it and they still haven't done proper research?
Yeah, well, again, like I alluded to earlier, I think this one issue is because the pharmaceutical industry is unique in its power. That even though research groups are now speaking up about aluminum and saying there's a potential problem or there's not, but we haven't researched it. Everyone's admitting it has not been properly researched. That has not made its way into the media, and the governments are not looking at it yet. It seems that it's only in the scientific community, and they're trying to quash it because it has to do with not just the pharmaceutical company, because they are vulnerable when it comes to medications and medical devices, but their vaccine industry is so well protected that that's like the one thing that the media and the governments are not going to speak out about. So it's up to the scientific community and it's up to the public to start speaking up about this.
So is it time for a battle cry, maybe?
Yeah.
I mean, is this time for the public to really start demanding
that
aluminum is removed?
Yeah, absolutely.
From all vaccines?
Yeah, so the more people that learn about this, and something I forgot to mention earlier, but maybe we'll see what either Chris Shaw or Chris Exley might have to say about this, but there is a researcher, Girardi. He published again in 2015, so not that long ago, in the Frontiers in Neurology.
He's French, right? And he's
Girardi, I don't know.
I think he's French.
He published Biopersistence and Brain Translocation of Aluminum Adjuvants of Vaccines. And what his group did, which this was brand new to me recently. Like, I didn't know about this. And I always wondered, well, where does the aluminum go? What happens to it? And you alluded to earlier in part one that they've figured out it goes to the bone and it goes to the brain, but how? And Girardi's group, they basically looked at 50 research studies, 50 that show how our immune cells in the muscle where we get the injections, they absorb the aluminum at the site of injection. Those immune cells move through our lymph nodes. Then they take the aluminum throughout the entire body, everywhere where the immune cells will travel, and they take it into the brain. They actually say it doesn't just flow into the bloodstream. We're finding it doesn't show in the blood, like in that newborn study they did 24 hours after injection, it was not in the blood. That's in part because the immune cells are taking it through the lymphatic system and throughout our body into our brain. And Girardi's group says that explains why the effects of aluminum might be delayed, but they are very serious, and there are very serious neurotoxic effects on the brains of our children. And so again, that's another group. Worldwide, more and more researchers are speaking out about this, and to me, that is extremely encouraging.
Well, it's necessary.
Well, it is necessary, but again, I think they're just saying, as long as we can show it's not getting into the bloodstream and people are excreting it in the urine, they can just do these, fake studies that demonstrate, those aspects of safety. Then they can keep using it. But again, because this industry is so dependent on it, I predict that we will not see a change in aluminum until there's a viable alternative. Our industry is too scared to stop using hepatitis B vaccine and Hep A vaccine and pneumococcal and DTP vaccine and HPV vaccine. The idea of stopping those vaccines because of the dangers of aluminum.
Well, they wouldn't. They wouldn't stop it without an alternative.
No, but it scares them so much.
They wouldn't. I mean, they just wouldn't.
You're right, they won't. And because there's so much money lost, but they'll just paint it as our society, everyone will start dying left and right.
Right, diseases are going to come back everywhere.
Even if aluminum is dangerous, it's okay because we have to stop these diseases. The public, I think, is smarter than that. But they'll try to cover this up. They'll keep going until there's an alternative that is cheap to implement, and who knows if the alternative is going to be safe, right? We don't know if that's. Well,
to clarify too for people, the reason they took thimerosal out was because it's a preservative, not an adjuvant.
The only thing it did is allow them to make multi-dose vials. That's all it did.
So when somebody will go, they took mercury out. Why can't they do that with aluminum? Aluminum serves a completely different purpose. However, Dr. Shaw does say that there is, and I've heard two different people mention two different things that are considered viable options for replacing aluminum adjuvants. But this is relatively new, and this would take a complete overhaul, which still goes back to the clinical trials, the money, all of those types of things. And it's a matter of them getting enough pressure to do it.
Yeah. And
to at least try.
Right. And we're the only ones that'll provide that pressure, but now we have more support in the scientific community, which is good. I wanted to, I think, just end, I don't know if you have more to say. I wanted to just end with listing or reading just a few animal studies. We're going to hear from Dr. Shaw and Dr. Exley about some of their research work in animal studies and how they've proven pretty much without much doubt whatsoever that vaccine aluminum is causing neurotoxicity in animal studies. But just the sheer number of animal studies that actually have proven that to be true is pretty astounding. I mean, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I have 13 studies just here on one piece of paper that talks about it.
And can you include those as a...
Oh, yeah. We'll include all of these in the link. And basically, I won't even read these, but the titles of each of these studies basically says aluminum adjuvants in vaccines are causing, we're finding long-term neurologic problems in animal studies.
Right.
And there really is no doubt about that. And because we can't study humans that way.
Yeah, animal studies are the best thing that we have.
Is our industry going to listen to that? And we need the people to force them into that. Mm-hmm. All right. And I mean, you could almost make the argument, if we know aluminum is for sure dangerous, could you make the argument that would you actually be safer avoiding all the aluminum containing vaccines and just living with the disease risk? And that's, I think, what each parent has to decide for themselves.
And you can go visit in our season 1 any of the childhood vaccines that we did disease and vaccine on to find out kind of what that prevalence is and what that risk is, because it's all based on where you live and what your age is and the circumstance and things like that in general. And some of the numbers listed, Dr. Bob put together a page kind of that talks about some of these, number of micrograms in each of the different vaccines and kind of what's in formula, what's in breast milk. And he'll put that in a page that we can host on our website for you guys to access after this episode too, to get more information, as well as the studies he's talking about, the studies we talked about today. And the thing about aluminum is this is really just the surface of it, honestly. Like I said, I've got probably 50 more studies to go through that we can maybe revisit this in towards the end of our season, come back to some things if we've, come across the best of the best and just summarize some things so we can put it in one place for you guys. Hopefully you'll find that these episodes are something you can pass along to people, and that you feel like if you knew a little bit, you know a little bit more. If you knew nothing, now you know a little bit. Mm-hmm. Our whole thing is just to give information, and you cannot talk about vaccine safety without talking about aluminum. This is really a huge, huge part of the problem, I believe. Of course, we've got the number of doses. We've got, the aggressive schedule, too many, too soon. There are a lot of aspects to this, but aluminum is definitely a problem and something that we'll have to continue talking about. And hopefully this was, valuable information for you guys.
Yeah. And it can be very complicated. We try to keep it simple but I don't know how much we succeeded in that, because it is a very complicated topic. But we are very excited to be able to talk to two aluminum researchers, coming up, Dr. Chris Shaw and Dr. Christopher Exley. One's from Canada and one's from the UK. And I don't know, it might be.
Ooh, do I get to practice my English accent?
I was thinking. No, it'd be so fun. Is you could use your accent.
And just pretend I'm pretend I'm English at the beginning.
No, totally. And
let's see,
and I'll ask. Well, so Dr. Exley, where do you think Melissa's from, based on her accent? And
you know what? I would.
Worst accent.
No, it's not. First of all, it's not that bad. And secondly, I would do it. I really would. If I didn't think it took away from the reverence and respect for having a guest on there, because I wouldn't do that for that reason. But otherwise, I would totally do it.
Could I do my Canadian accent with Chris Shaw?
No, you can't, because my psychic abilities tell me we may have already recorded that episode and you missed out on your Canadian accent.
All right.
Anyway, so thank you guys for listening, and we will catch you next time on the Vaccine Conversation.
The information in this podcast is for entertainment purposes only. It is not intended as medical advice. Always consult your healthcare professional for information on vaccines and infectious diseases.